is Wednesday, June 12th. I'm Tim Darnell. Welcome to this edition of Political Update here on Atlanta News First. Our show and stream this week is produced, as always, by Maria Moreau, and we are covering a number of very important political topics for all of our readers and viewers. Here's what some of the headlines that we're following right now. Vice President Kamala Harris will be in Atlanta on Friday. Early voting in all of Georgia's runoff elections is underway. One of the races we're following is the race to become the new CEO of Georgia's fourth largest county, that being DeKalb County. Really a stunning development over the weekend when a congressional candidate walked off the stage during a debate, and finally we'll be looking at the impact of Donald Trump's conviction in New York on his case here in Georgia. First of all, Vice President Harris will be making her fourth trip to the state of Georgia this Friday, when she will be attending the 100 Black Men of America conference to be held at the Hyatt Regency in downtown Atlanta. Georgia is a battleground state and will be hugely important in this year's 2024 presidential election. We've already seen several visits already from the vice president as well as her boss, 46th President of the United States, that being Joe Biden, with more visits we're sure to come between now and Election Day, November 5th. Early voting is underway throughout all of Georgia's runoff elections. We're following three Metro Atlanta races, one of which is for the CEO of DeKalb County. Two candidates, Lorraine Cochran Johnson and Larry Johnson, are running to become the CEO of DeKalb County, seeking to replace the outgoing and retiring Michael Thurmond. Both Lorraine Cochran Johnson and Larry Johnson made the May 21st general primary runoff, neither of whom secured enough of the majority vote to avoid a runoff. So in a heavily Democratic DeKalb County, it's safe to say whoever wins next Tuesday's runoff will be the next CEO of DeKalb County. Early voting, as I said, is underway throughout all of Georgia's runoffs, and one race that is not in our viewing area, but nonetheless saw a very surprising development this past weekend during a debate that was being hosted by Georgia Public Broadcasting for the Republican nomination for the 2nd Congressional District in southwest Georgia. Wayne Johnson was debating Chuck Hand. Both of these gentlemen were in the runoff for the Republican nomination to challenge the dean of Georgia's congressional delegation, Sanford Bishop, who has been in office since 1993. In November, the very first question that was asked of Mr. Hand, he did not answer. He went into a statement about who he is and why he's running, and then he walked off the debate stage and held a short press conference afterward, which we're watching a little bit of right now. It was really unprecedented. Our own Doug Reardon was one of the panelists during the debate, really something that you don't see very often when a candidate shows up, makes an open statement, and then refuses to debate his opponent by walking off the stage. Again, the 2nd Congressional District is in southwest Georgia, which also includes the hometown of the nation's 35th president and Georgia's favorite son, James Earl Carter, Jr. Moving on to the case of the 45th president of the United States. Several weeks ago, 2 weeks ago to be precise, Donald Trump was convicted on 34 felony counts in a Manhattan courtroom in New York City, charges that were related to falsifying business records as they pertain to a hush money payment to an adult entertainment star in an attempt now, convicted attempt of attempting to bury some embarrassing stories about then candidate Donald Trump, who was running for president for the first time. Donald Trump is the first former president ever to not only face criminal charges, but also to be convicted on felony or criminal counts. In this case, 34 felony counts related to business falsification records. We had a conversation very recently with one of our outstanding political analysts, Dr. Ben Taylor, professor of political science at Kennesaw State University, on how Donald Trump's conviction in New York City may affect the case against him being brought by Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis, and a case that is now on hold until further notice, until a further ruling by the Georgia Court of Appeals. Here is that conversation with Dr. Ben Taylor. On June 5th, 2024, the Georgia Court of Appeals issued a stay in all criminal proceedings against former President Donald Trump here in Fulton County, Georgia. There are all sorts of political implications for this, and in this development, I'm Tim Darnell. Welcome to this special edition of Political Update here on Atlanta News First from our Midtown Atlanta studios, and we are joined by one of our favorite people to talk with, talking all things politics, Dr. Ben Taylor, professor of political science at Kennesaw State University. Were you surprised when you heard the Georgia Court of Appeals had issued a stay in all of the proceedings against the 45th President of the United States?
No, not really, because in fact that's quite common when you have these judicial proceedings, when you move to one level of appeals. Typically, whatever the trial process at the lower level, particularly when it's in the middle of the trial process, whatever was going on at the lower level is typically stayed so that the appeals process can go forward, and then they can reset the trial schedule later. So that's quite common and honestly to be expected.
Now, Donald Trump, we all know, is the first former American president, first president ever, sitting or former, to be criminally convicted on numerous felony counts. From a political aspect, how does that conviction affect what's happening here in Georgia?
Well, that's a really good question because it's hard to know. As you pointed out, there's never been a case like this in American history. But what we do know at present is that because it's been a couple of weeks now since that's happened, the polls, which before this happened, there were poll questions that, hypothetically asked the respondents, how would this event, Donald Trump's potential conviction, affect your vote choice or potential vote choice? And so people would answer these hypothetical questions. It's no longer hypothetical, and we've seen a very, very small amount of movement in polls, national polls, right? So it's a bit harder to sort of understand how this works in subgroups, particular demographic groups, but at the national level, there has been a small and subtle shift towards President Biden currently, but again, polls are a snapshot in time. So that's what's going on now. What will happen as a result of this 6 weeks or 8 to 3 months from now, we're not really sure. So the bottom line, though, is that right now it does look like there's been a small, subtle shift towards President Biden away from Donald Trump as a result of the convictions. The question is, how stable is that shift, and how solid is that shift?
A central figure in what's happening in Fulton County here with the indictments of Donald Trump and more than a dozen of his GOP allies allegedly having engaged in a criminal-like conspiracy to overturn Georgia's 2020 election. Central figure in all of this is Fulton County DA Fani Willis. Recently elected or re-elected to her position as far as the Democratic Party nomination by an overwhelming margin. How does the stay here in the related to the Georgia Court of Appeals, how does that affect her case or her political standing in the community? She's enormously popular in Fulton County.
Right. I can't imagine that this is going to have much of an effect on her position because, again, this is a decision that was out of her hands personally. DAs have a lot of leeway when it comes to making decisions on cases to prosecute or not prosecute, or what level of charges to bring, and that can affect the standing of local officials and DAs in particular. But in this instance, this was an appeals court staying the proceedings at present, and so I wouldn't expect that there to be much of an effect on Fani Willis. But at the same time, if the case is, if her position in the case or the case itself is somehow affected by the appellate process, then that could make things different. But at present, I wouldn't expect there to be much of an effect on her political outlook, personally.
Governor Brian Kemp and the GOP-led state legislature has passed a district attorney's oversight council. Some were thinking that Fulton County DA Fani Willis was perhaps a target of this, perhaps also the district attorney for Athens-Clarke County, Deborah Gonzalez. If Fani Willis is disqualified from further prosecuting her case against former President Donald Trump, how difficult will it be for another district attorney to come in and take over this case, or will there be any takers at all?
That is a really good question, and honestly, it's always difficult once a case has been slowed down like this. The only question is how good is the evidence, right? So another prosecutor to come in would have to make a decision for themselves. As I said a moment ago, DAs have a tremendous amount of leeway and latitude when it comes to bringing cases or not bringing cases and the level of charges to bring and what have you. So in the event that someone else had to take this over, they would then have to go through the entire process of evaluating the evidence, looking at the testimony that's already been had, looking at depositions, looking at all the pretrial stuff that's already been done, and deciding, is this case worth the time and effort that, sunk cost being what it is this case worth the time and effort to go forward? And that's an open question.
From a purely political perspective, what would be the damages to Fulton County DA Fani Willis if she were indeed disqualified over the now admitted romantic relationship which she had with a now former special prosecutor Nathan Wade, and whether or not the two benefited financially from their relationship? Could she recover from a disqualification of one of the highest profile judicial cases in American history?
Well, what we know from the political science research on scandals, particularly scandals at the lower level of politics, this is a local politics issue, is that name recognition is crucial. Fani Willis is extremely well known in the community. She is, as evidenced by her recent re-election to the Democratic nomination for Fulton County DA, which is a de facto win in that race, more or less, for the fall. She's extremely popular currently. And so if she were to be disqualified in this instance, I would imagine that she would be able to weather that because of the repository of goodwill. The question is, when it comes to things like district attorneys or other sort of positions where there are outcomes that are expected of those political positions, despite this very high-profile case perhaps being troublesome for her, is she able to take care of the other responsibilities of the office? And at present, there's no indication that people in Fulton County are upset with her on that front.
These are issues that we're going to continue to follow here at our breaking news desk and our first alert desk here at Atlanta News First. Thanks to Dr. Ben Taylor, political science professor at Kennesaw State University, for joining us for this edition of Political Update. Thanks to all of you for watching and listening, and stay with Atlanta News First as Georgia continues its spotlight in the nation's political spectrum.